In this assignment, you were asked to do a partial DuPont analysis, compute a few of the ratios that are part of the DuPont analysis for two fictitious companies, consumer electronics and large retailer. Although I can tell you now that these figures were taken from actual balance sheet and income statement of two real companies, and we'll see what those companies are by the time we get to the end of this exercise. But the questions that we had were compute three different ratios: the return on equity, the asset turnover, and the operating margin, and then see what you can say about the operations performance of these two companies based on these financial ratios. So let's go through the computations first for the three ratios, and then see what we can say about these two companies in two different industries, right? So first we have the return on equity based on the ratio of earnings to equity, and what you can see is that the consumer electronics company had a return on equity of around 34%, and the large retailer had it about 21%. So if you observe, the equity was almost equal. However, the earnings for the consumer electronics were a bit higher, and that was resulting in the difference in the return on equity. So there's about a 13% difference in the return on equity between the two companies based on the earnings being higher for the consumer electronics company. Next, we had the asset turnover. So how quickly do they turn over? How quickly do they use the assets in order to generate sales? And we had sales for the consumer electronics and the large retailer. And just from that row, you can see that the large retailer had a much larger amount of sales. The asset base that was used by the consumer electronics company was large in comparison to its sales. The large retailer had a larger asset base, but had quite substantially larger amount of sales as well. So the asset turnover turned out to be very much higher for the large retailer. Not a surprise when you think about the way a retailer would work. They would have large stores through which they're selling, so the asset base would not need to be very expensive, and they would be able to generate sales out of it. On the other hand, if you think about the operating margin, a large retailer, the function that they serve is they're purchasing products from suppliers and keeping it ready on their shelves for customers. They're probably paying their suppliers based on credit, while they are getting paid in cash or customers using credit cards. And so they can't really expect a huge margin on their products. And that's what plays out here. The operating margin for the large retailer is 3.5% versus about 24% for the consumer electronics company. So substantially larger for the consumer electronics company. Now let's put these three ratios that we just calculated together and see what implications we can find from this. So the return on equity was higher for the consumer electronics company, and we attributed that to higher operating margin as well. They had higher earnings, which plays out in the last row of 24% operating margin. The asset turnover, on the other hand, was very high for the large retailer. So what are the implications, and what does this tell us about these two industries? First of all, we can't really say if these are good numbers until we have a comparison with other companies in that same industry, or we have a year-to-year comparison. So that's one thing that we cannot really say too much about. But what we can do is get some inferences about comparing these ratios across these two companies. So why would a consumer electronics company have a higher return on equity and operating margin, while a large retailer would have a high asset turnover? So here are the things that you can think of as being the underlying reasons. So for a consumer electronics company, and this now I can reveal, is Apple, right? This is, I took these figures from the balance sheet and income statement of Apple, and for the retailer I had used Walmart. So these were the two companies from which I used the figures from. For the consumer electronics company, now that you can think about Apple, it has a larger asset base because it needs factories, assembly lines for production of its products, and it may be selling, giving credit to its customers. There are retail outlets that may be buying from it that it's giving credit to. So it has a larger asset base in that sense, in terms of fixed assets as well as current assets, in terms of what it's investing in terms of fixed assets, as well as the receivables in terms of credit it's giving to its customers. Consumer electronics company would be basing their competence would be differentiation of their products, so they would be commanding a higher margin, right? So whatever their cost of production is, they would be commanding a higher margin, and that would result in a higher operating margin as well as higher return on equity. And the price premium would give them the same in terms of higher operating margin as well as higher return on equity. For the retailer, their fixed asset base is not much. They own the stores a lot of times, and if you think about a company like Walmart, they don't even own the inventory that's in those stores, because it's P&G that's storing the inventory there, and based on different supply chain programs that they have or different contracts that they might have with different companies, they might not own. They may own some of the inventory in their stores, but they might not own all of their inventory in their stores. So their asset base in that sense would be smaller. Their receivables would be less, so they would have in terms of what is payable to them from customers. Customers are usually paying cash or credit card, and they're getting their money quickly. And they have fast-moving inventories. So if you think of Walmart, they're especially good at this. They move their inventories pretty quickly. But as a retailer, if you want to get better, that's what you would be doing, is you would be focusing on moving their inventories through the system very quickly, because that's where you make the money. You don't have too much of a margin, operating margin, so you make money by moving your inventories quickly. So what you'll find is that the inventory turnover ratio is going to be very high for a retailer. And if you think about Apple computers, Apple as a company is also very good at moving its inventory, but even then it falls short of when you compare it to a Walmart. What this also would tell you is that if you want to compare against the best in other industries, you could think of these two companies as being benchmarks. Walmart for how good your inventory turnover ratio can be. So if that's something you want to emulate, it gives you a benchmark number. And for consumer electronics, the kind of margins that Apple has, if that's a benchmark that you go after, you could be having much larger return on investment.